time to mount the clutch. Fortunately, I was able to get clutch alignment tool locally at my local auto parts. Let's get this going. Now, when you're putting a clutch on, you can't just turn the bolts down and then torque them to spec. What you actually need to do is you need to turn the bolts a quarter turn at a time. A quarter to a half turn based on, you know, how much room you have, but go half a turn, half a turn, half a turn, half a turn until the pressure plate sits down. That way you'll come down evenly. If you just tighten them all down, even if you use the proper sequence, you'll end up with a clutch plate that's shifted off where it needs to be, and yeah, your car is gonna feel like it's about to rattle apart. Don't do it. So first things first, let's get this mounted on the studs. All right. Let's take our nifty little alignment tool here, and there we go. Now we're popped in. Are we popped in? Yeah, we're in. Have a South African clutch, go figure. Alright. Put that down over the studs. Let's start putting the bolts in one by one. I'm just gonna turn these down by hand until they're about snug. Alright, no real pressure on them. You gotta tighten these down 14 to 19 foot-pounds. So I've actually got my torque wrench here ready to go. And of course, when you have the engine out of the car, like if you were doing this underneath the car, you wouldn't need to, but because the engine is outside of the car right now, or actually no, I'm wrong, even with the engine inside of the car, you need something to stop the engine from turning as you're trying to tighten this down. Some people put a screwdriver or something here. I think that method sucks. I have a socket on the crank pulley on the other side butting up against the pallet so that this can't turn, and that works pretty well.
So then I did a ton of wrenching because those bloody quarter and half turns take forever.
It's a good idea to number these bolts so that you don't lose track of the sequence, because it's easy to do.
With the clutch torqued down to specs, the next step on my list was to go ahead and install the throwout bearing. Now this is a pretty simple step. All you need to do is to grease up the input shaft of the transmission and to grease up the bearing slightly and make sure that it slides freely when the fork goes back and forth. Make sure not to go overboard with the grease or else you risk it getting on the clutch disc. Having installed the throwout bearing, I went ahead and installed the transmission to the engine. Now this is a pretty simple step that you can do by yourself, especially when you're doing a car like a Miata, because the transmission is small and fairly light. All you need to do is have some wood or something to stack up under it to line it up properly and then put it in. From there, all you got to do is torque down all the bolts in the right sequence, and that's extra easy to do when it's all outside of the car because you don't have the car in the way of the bolts that you're tightening down. Of course, this is all much easier to do if your garage isn't as packed as mine or if you have an open shop floor to do it on. While the starter that came with this engine was in fairly good shape, it was also fairly dirty, so I went ahead and wiped it down before putting it on. As you can likely guess at this point, installing the starter is the next step once you have the transmission on. Much like installing the transmission, installing the starter is way easier with everything outside of the car. And just like that, we're done installing the starter. Stay tuned for the next episode of Proper Style where you'll finally get to see me put this engine in the car.